In any conversation you find yourself witness to regarding art which is of a terse or ambiguous variety, or regarding any question in any piece of work which leaves readers, viewers, or players less satiated for answers they may have liked, you are likely to hear some variation of the phrase, "It has been left up to the imagination." Something about this phrase I don't like and I can't like. My reasons for disliking the cliche have varied greatly with time. First, I should say a little bit about the saying. When someone says that something's been left up to the imagination, they're talking about some details or facts or potential stuff in a work of media or art that we hypothetically could have been told by the author about, but which we have not actually been told about. The classic example is Lovecraft, who, they report, often left details of monsters or horrifying creatures in his work abstract, vague, or essentially blurry. All I can remember about the monsters in The Shadow over Innsmouth is that they are from the water, aquatic, fish-like. The actual details are not important. Comparatively, in Resident Evil, I could probably find out the exact anatomy of many creatures. The idea often goes, in the Lovecraft conversation, that this whole left up to the imagination thing is good because it allows you to fill in the blanks, making a personalized horror for yourself, which you find more frightening and disturbing than anything the author specifically could have come up with. Similar discussions could have taken place with regards to story or lore ambiguities in Dark Souls, where again it would be raised that the story you invent for yourself is more compelling in likelihood than anything the author could have specifically wrote in. So what's the issue with an idea like that? Is it not true that you know what is frightening or interesting to you yourself more than the author could? It's not really that which I have an issue with. To put it in one succinct statement, can't the point of showing less simply be to show less? Many altered states of perception being confer an entirely different feeling onto the world. If you had a sickness and got delirium, you'd probably find the world quite a bit different. If you were sick in a way that made you have, medical grade confusion, your world would also probably be quite different. I think Everywhere at the End of Time is a great example, because the vagueness is the point. Someone is losing their grasp on clarity and lucidity, and that is an entirely distinct experience from being lucid. Anyone who has endured an altered experience, drug-induced or not, can know what I'm talking about. The most distinct example in my life came from sepsis, where I had delirium a little while and confusion for a day or two after. It was an interesting haze. Maybe you, like me, have always been interested and fascinated by such experiences and feelings. Some find those kinds of sentiments or feelings or experiences disturbing, depressing. The moments can feel, people say, empty, detached, or lacking contact with concrete reality. They say it is not affirm living, it's life rejecting. I don't really know whether it's life affirming or what, but I really love those experiences. Because I love those experiences, I am very reticent to assert that the beauty of many vague situations and worlds actually stems from the substitution of a fuzzy world with a definite but subjective one, or interchange, I actually think it is not like that at all, and I think reducing a vague world to one which has simply had details removed and which should be present, rejects the legitimacy of being less defined. There is a certain kind of benevolence or mercy to not bleaching something out in full detail and revealing everything, quote-unquote, about it. Usually, everything is not very interesting at all. Things are more interesting, oftentimes, when you know some things and not all things, because then they're dynamic, full of life and questions unanswered, which drive further interest. But even that's a step too far for me. To assert that the beauty of something ill-defined in some sense comes from this dynamic livelihood, I think that it is simply a beautiful and rare image which cannot be found in usual reality. When we say something is incomplete, like a depiction of a place or some events, it is because we have a certain expectation of how much we can actually know about situations and places in general. I should be able to know important things, so the logic goes. Well, what's important? It's quite subjective, and something which you've become accustomed to as per your time and place, and of course your intellectual capacities and your sensory knowledge, your sensory abilities. Many things mediate this. Knowing the temperature some meat is at during cooking is something we can expect today in our average lives if we really want to quite a precise degree, because of technological progress, allowing for a theory of heat and a way of measuring that heat. There's a lot of stuff we feel accustomed to knowing, or which become part of our requirements for a quote-unquote complete understanding one was satisfied with, which we would not have been accustomed to in many other circumstances. With art, things are a little bit different. We don't expect to know as many specific details, but we certainly still have a set of learned expectations about what can and should be known. If we assume a pedagogical, moral structure in art, where the purpose is to give us some educatory message, then we expect to know the things that make the argument coherent. If it's a moral story about the murder of someone, then we might expect to know who killed the guy, why did they kill him, why were they wrong to do so, why were they not? Similar questions. What is telling is that there are many questions we do not expect answers to. How fast was the wind moving on a specific day? Where was Abe Lincoln during this time if it was set in a period where he was alive? He's not part of the story. There are a great many things we don't consider the answers to be relevant or necessary. Another good example, in my opinion, is verisimilitude, where there are many questions people are often on the middle on. For example, in Fallout New Vegas, there's a lot of ado about the way that, and I know Mr. Beatong made videos about this way back in the day, New Vegas shows you where they grow the food, where they make their living, how they actually have the agriculture to sustain these populations in New Vegas, whereas Fallout 3 does not, which is a point he gave in favor to New Vegas. Many people nowadays are very keen on this idea, verisimilitude, and they feel like it's part of what makes good world building, or even a necessary requirement. Other people insist that it's unnecessary, unfun, uninteresting, and so on. However, I find it interesting that there's a line almost everyone has where too little has been said or given regarding the world. I don't think that it's necessarily true that there shouldn't be a line at all, but I certainly do think that we don't really reflect on where we draw those lines very much. We just kind of go with our gut on what we feel like we should know without considering the way it would change the entire feeling of the work. In danger of becoming a little too abstract, I would say that what is really happening when someone insists that the world as given in a work is incomplete with missing details is that they are insisting, really, that the depiction should conform to an implicit standard for what constitutes a complete set of information. I think that is constraining, unnecessarily constraining, and I think it gets in the way of beauty, because it insists that beauty comes second to fulfilling an ultimately arbitrary set of constraints. So, when we make arguments for ambiguity, abstraction, or the unusually vague, as features in art, in my opinion as virtues, we often implicitly assume, anyway, that they are not legitimate on their own and need to be justified in comparison to the standard level of information we expect to see. We might justify them by saying that, well, it allows you to make your own very specific world which conforms to your complete set of information, which is even better, or it keeps you asking questions about the story, or this or that, Maybe there doesn't need to be an answer. I know that's such a cliche, but excuse me. Really, an atypical expression versus one which adheres to standard protocols of communication we use in art, that's what we're looking at when we talk about something of a complete set of information or not. We have many requirements implicitly when it comes to the way we receive and process art, which should be shown, how it may be shown, and for what purpose we are to be shown anything at all. Often art has a moral purpose, like I stated earlier regarding an educatory message, or at least an argument it has to make, which constitutes the point of the art, the very pretentious point, the argument, the crux of it, all that, which as you can tell I don't exactly have a super positive opinion of, thinking of that as the central theme in art, the central point, that it has to have a argument, a point, of something it says. Not everything needs a literary message, a message you can put in words. I don't think an experience has to be a message in the sense of it doesn't need to come away as having been a large argument for some big hypothesis in the sky, which is sometimes what it feels like. And oftentimes it feels like even if there isn't a definite argument that's been made, you at least have to have some kind of thematic point, some theme you're fixated on, or this or that. These are literary ideas. And sadly, in my opinion, even otherwise stalwart bastions of the notions that games can be art do not look to find the art in games as they are. They instead look to the idea that games may have a point in that way, which is interesting. An interesting point. You can have an interesting point. Like BioShock Infinite. This was a beloved game for critics. back in its day. It was a kind of controversial one too. In my opinion, it's the writers who are to blame for this. Although I don't actually hold it against writers, I just mean the artistic content of a game is often reduced to its literary content. The depth of its themes, its story, or its argument, stuff like that. Characters, psychology, etc. Similar reductions happen all the time for example, the cinematic contents of a game used to be more popular, I feel like, in the PlayStation 3 generation, late PlayStation 2, for somewhat technical reasons with the PlayStation 2, because with those games in that period of time, baking lighting, when you have a static scene, or let's say you have a static camera angle, you can bake lighting onto everything in a way that makes it look really good, even though you're just using stored textures. You're not having to do a bunch of lighting updates and calculations. That was really advantageous, and it created a style which was very cinematic, and it looked really good for the time. Like Devil May Cry 3, I think of as a great example. I think that game looks beautiful today. But it's not that I think that writing and film are bad mediums. Obviously not. It's that I think we often saddle artistic communication with too many expectations and preconceptions. If I had carried into my, for example, confused or delirious haze, when I had sepsis, the idea that a beautiful day needs to make a poignant point about my life that can wrap up in a Hallmark gift card, I would not have found anything beautiful at all. I don't think that would have enriched me for holding that dogma, for holding it against the experience. I really don't think so. And I think, oftentimes these dogmas we have that we consider, what has to go into a work of art, what has to be visible, what has to be told to me, these just get in the way of enjoying interesting, altered experiences. But I want to revisit the topic of verisimilitude. I don't really know where I stand on it. It seems to me that a good writer often is worldly about many things, and therefore tends to naturally reproduce faithfully many important aspects of life one may not initially consider. So for example, Melville has tons and tons and tons of random facts in Moby Dick, or The Whale, It's just all kinds of stuff. He was very into his subject matter, not just in the sense of, as an abstract setting for a story, but it's just all kinds of little historical sides, and then the biology of the whales and all that kind of thing. So like with the earlier example, how a community acquires its food is very important, not just like for nerds. It's important as a thematic part of the story oftentimes. It says something really real about the society. The idea that you can detach all the thematic contents of a society's morality from its economic production is just quite naive, in my opinion, which is a problem that many games admittedly have in the writing. The writing in games can be quite naive, quite a little bit like a fantasy book. Not the best kind of fantasy book, in my opinion, though pardon my judgment, I don't mean to be pompous. The routes and methods of travel connecting people are also really important, and that's one of the reasons people love Fallout New Vegas. Those two examples: food, transit, all this other stuff, focusing on the dam, the geography of it all. It's really well fleshed out in terms of verisimilitude. I think it does it quite well, and focuses a lot on rather material issues and circumstances facing the people in its world. However, I certainly do not think that this is the apex of art, especially in games, of artistic aesthetic sentiment. For I think that although it may be interesting and satisfying to the mind, it is not particularly beautiful on its own. And what do I mean by beautiful? That's a whole topic you can get into. So, in the way that when someone holds like a fabric they find particularly soothing or likable, they feel like it's this beautiful silk, it's amazing. They don't think about the functional utility of the fabric or the it's not intellectually stimulating. They take sensory and emotional satisfaction from being in contact with the fabric intrinsically. The fabric is intrinsically satisfying. Beauty does not serve the mind or function, even though it may be related. Maybe it even is often related. And you could disagree with me and say that, really, truly, it goes down to evolution, so it's just this functional thing or whatever. But I don't think that does justice to the subjective sense of beauty, which is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about beauty as a material phenomenon or that happens with people or trying to break it down as a sociological phenomenon. I'm just saying, subjectively, when I say something's beautiful, what am I saying? That's what I'm saying. To me, the intrinsic appreciation for the experience or the thing you're having. I do think there's a difference between these kind of modes of appreciation, like something which stimulates my mind or something which stimulates my sense of pragmatism or morality, which that very old school idea. I'm lumping together the functional, practical, and moral. For me, all these, I'm just putting on this table of saying, to do with action, right? To do with action. So, It doesn't stimulate my sense of what I can or should do. It doesn't stimulate my sense of intellect. It's an appreciation for the experience or the object in and of itself. That's aesthetic appreciation to me. There's a game I really want to talk about. I Divine Cybermancy. It stands out to me in a lot of ways, because this world is so inspired and full of artistic energy, yet in others, incomplete and a work in progress, highly partial, in ways that confer to me that abstract and vague sense that I find so very interesting. For example, if you go on Mars, there's a catacomb. There's catacombs on Mars. You can go and you can explore around and see all these weird, Coulter Day looking corpses, which is one of the factions in the game. Your protagonist faction. You see these guys sitting on these thrones like monks that have been encased, or something. It's really interesting. You can see all kinds of stuff in there, and you know what? There's nothing in the game that tells you what that's about. There's no explicit part of the game, insofar as I remember, that tells you what that place is about, what it's doing there. And to me, it's a little dreamlike how incomplete all the little details are, in the sense that they're superficially coherent and they make sense, but they provoke questions that just don't have answers, and questions you may not even ask. So the story is dissociative and confusing. The dialogue itself for an English player is poorly translated, which has its own abstract charm, but it's an experience. It's vulgar, it's poorly translated, jargled. It's a mess. Okay. It contains, in my opinion, many interesting artistic sensations. Believe it or not. I think most people would consider this game kind of slop. Okay, so that's why I'm bringing it up, because I think this is a perfect example of how a lot of times we think about this stuff when we compare like BioShock Infinite or Gone Home, which I don't know if you can tell I'm old. I'm an old person because these are the two games I bring up. But, BioShock Infinite or Gone Home, and we compare that to Call of Duty. God, I'm so dated. But anyway, the point is that, I don't think it's like that. I think that actually there are interesting artistic experiences all over the gaming spectrum that kind of get labeled as not artistic, not interesting, not aesthetic, because we are obsessed, laser focused on first literary influence. Like what are the themes of the writing? So like I have bad writing. I Divine Cybermancy is not like well written. Maybe it was in French. I don't know. Which by the way is another detail. Most people think I Divine Cybermancy is a Russian game based on vibes. It's actually French. So which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If you ever heard French, the dudes sound so French, the voice actors. But anyway, the point is that so I think that this kind of game is often overlooked in terms of its artistic content because it doesn't fit cleanly into our preconceptions about what an artistic game looks like, and the kind of people who do like it oftentimes have a bias towards, pretentious ideas about aesthetic value in games. Despite that, I think that once we have more consciousness about games, we'll see these kind of games as really, they do something that's just interesting. That feeling of being in a dream is very hard to capture in other mediums. I'm not saying it's impossible, but being there with all the senses you have access to in a game, which I guess is just two, but also just your contact with the world, moving around, it really ties stuff together immersively in a way that makes those dreamlike experiences very fascinating. But anyway, the world is quite vividly put together, but your sense of place and time are confused and distorted. There is much written in the game, about the history or the context or stuff like that, but things never really come together. They don't really. It's totally unrelated to the stuff you actually encounter in the game. Like you'll read in the archives about the early Metastrumon outbreak, whatever, and then you get in the game world, and it's just there's really not that much in relation to that. And then the writing of the actual events going on is it's like a David Lynch movie. It's just ridiculous, I'm not even gonna get into it. The things you're being told are always at odds with the direct experience you faced. Historical accounts of life in such a distant past, it may as well be irrelevant. Like those Metastrumon outbreaks, tens of thousands of years ago, before the Secretary even existed, which is the faction you're part of. The world is beautifully built and full of many dark, strange places, whose purposes and functions can be rather abstract. We are never given a truly living or alive city to explore, for example. Even though we do go to cities multiple times, civilians are always hidden away. There's nobody out doing anything. It's totally the total opposite of verisimilitude in every regard. You have all these sensible places, superficially sensible places for people to live and carry out. There's aqueducts and other stuff, and piping and sewers and city blocks and advertisements, but there's no people. There's nothing. You never really encounter people. The only people you encounter are looters and Federation guys and other, eye members, and just it's all like that, or streaming creatures, just monsters. Although we share the same places with these people, hypothetically, living civilians, where they ought to be, only gang members or street warriors or whatever are ever present, see. There's nothing like in Shadowrun Returns or Shadowrun Dragonfall or anything like that, where we'll have a discussion with a bartender, a mechanic, a normal person. Like, those games are so full of talking to real people. Talking to real people. And the thing about it is that those games, I don't know if I'd say they have verisimilitude. Yeah, you're talking to people, but I mean, it's not like there's I get to find out where the people are sourcing all their food from, or what the economic issues are like, or the political issues in depth. I mean, the political issues, excuse me, I like Shadowrun, the games, the computer games, the Shadowrun Returns, Shadowrun Dragonfall. I like those games, but the political writing is just the most black and white commentary ever. And it's black and white in a truthful way where there's people who are bigoted towards metahumans or stuff like that. They shouldn't be bigoted. These seem to be fine people. There's nothing wrong with them whatsoever, And I get the idea it's a commentary for oppression and bigotry in the real world, but as a writer, you can definitely explore bigotry and oppression in a really interesting way. It's hard usually because it's quite a difficult topic. It's if you want to do it justice, you have to show people actually being really horrible, being really monstrous. It's not fun stuff to write. It's not fun stuff to play. So usually it more so just shows up as oh yeah, well the guy's cool. He's he's cool with metahumans, or he's cool with whatever, And that, in my opinion, is there's not much fat there. You can tell anything about it. You can tell that there's just not much fat there because you can't write much about it. There's not much written content political in the game, and the little bit is there. It's just a little tiny sliver, And so anyway, my point is that for all the peoplefulness that Shadowrun might have, I don't think it does it justice. And I don't think it's doing something interesting with it. I think it's just an in-between where you're in a Walmart. We're in a Walmart, all the productive concerns, all the trouble, all the stuff that goes into getting you your 40 flavors of Fruit Loops are abstracted out. You don't even see the workers really in the back doing anything. There's a whole second part of the building you don't see. It's like Walmart, it's not verisimilitude. It's not fully fleshed out, and that's one issue I have with the idea of verisimilitude is it doesn't do justice to the way the real world is is abstracted. The real world is abstracted too. You don't go in the real world and enter a small farming town and think, oh, what's the history of this farm here? What's this? That? You just see just places, just with gas stations or whatever, just towns you just drive through, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem with the idea, but I think the point is that it frames the way people interact with reality. It's not really paying attention to how a subject actually goes through a world. It oftentimes winds up with a situation where you have all this information thrown at you, you have all this information given to you about the world, about how people are doing economically, where they're getting stuff from. And that's just not how real life is, because that stuff is everywhere. You can go find it if you want to, but you're not interested. So to me, it's just kind of usually a pet project for world builders to show that, oh, well, I planned it all out, and stuff like that. But there is no world detached from the way we are presented to it as a subject in fiction. The world is not like some magic place that exists and then we can go and learn about it like we're studying mathematics. It's an experience we have. And when you dedicate time to verisimilitude or these other things or fleshing things out, you have to keep in mind that you're altering the experience, which is one thing I feel like is not really paid attention to enough. Now, to be fair, like I said, I was just criticizing Shadowrun. It doesn't do either. Most games don't do either. Most games really don't. They're full of stuff that people expect, but they don't do anything interesting with it. They don't even do it rigorously, With I really feel like we're in like a phantom world. It's just abstract. There's no people around. It's just like a cartoon cutout of what a cyberpunk dystopia city should be. It's a very good one, in my opinion. And the sensation of being a phantom is very present to me personally, I feel, in those games. Yet you also feel like alive and vital. You don't feel like you're dead, like a ghost. You're going on about your business and fraternizing with the, gangsters or the Federation people or anything like that, and they're also in this little phantom world, but there's no normal human life. It's quite a unique feeling, in my opinion. In many other works, in many other mediums, The sense of being a phantom would be accompanied by an acute awareness of dissociation or some pretension of haunting this or that. In a game, it's easy to put you in the shoes of a ghost wandering around some midnight world where only, these couple agentic ideal spirits representing corrupt government guys, evil gangsters, and strange cybermonks are present. It can only really be considered like phantasmic on reflection. You don't feel that way when you play the game. You feel like, it's like, you never feel that way. And the reason why is that when you're playing a game, you're put in that first person perspective. You're not being reminded every 5 seconds, this is like hauntingly empty. Like if you were reading a book, it'd say, the streets were surprisingly empty. It was so quiet. I felt watched, something like that. You don't get that night because you're just going around, you're just staring at stuff, It's like, I don't really care, There's not like Bob the mechanic or whatever. Of course, to a ghost among ghosts, there's no meaning to the word. If you're surrounded by nothing but ghosts, like you are in I Divine Cybermancy, you don't see any of the street people or the Federation agents think, why are you here? No people are ever here. There's nothing like that, like the industrial center or whatever, or you don't think that. You're just going around, just some guys doing whatever, They're just like you. So, inverted and standing in the first-person perspective with a thematic subject, the themes disappear from active consideration and become present only in absence. The absence of people going about their lives, the absence of any logical connective structure necessary for human life to make sense. I wrote a script. I should elaborate on that, okay? I don't know if you can tell, I'm going through a thing where sometimes I'm speaking from the script, sometimes I'm not. Anyway, so what do I mean by that? I feel like the game is phantasmic. I feel like it's ghostly. I feel like it's ghostly because, like I said, there's no people around, there's no actual human life going on, all the stuff relevant for humans actually living, which is what I meant by that logical connective structure. The food, the whatever, just like transit, this or that. There's some transit in the eye, but it's pretty superficial, like buses scattered around. Just all the stuff that goes into an average person's daily life. What do people work here? What are their jobs? What do they do? You'll see giant buildings. What is this building about? Who is it? Do they live here? They build stuff. Is it like an employment place? Are they employed? Is it an office? None of that's there in I. And in that sense, I feel like it's ghostly. You're like a ghost wandering around the world of the living. You don't pay any attention to this stuff you don't care about because you're a ghost. It's not relevant to you. And in that way, the theme, you could see as a theme, which I don't think was the intention of the game at all, of being this ghost wandering around these abstract areas. It mixes very well, though, in my opinion, with like the dissociative feeling of the story overall. That theme only appears to you when you step back and you get outside of the game and you reflect on it, because it's what's not there that you would have to notice, and you really don't. You just don't, in my experience. So I would say, in a strange way, it's like when you're put in that first-person perspective, the thematic or the characteristics of the object of focus, of your first-person perspective, they disappear. You're the protagonist really disappears in the game in a way that just doesn't happen even in many works of fiction which don't have well-defined protagonists. You always are seeing properties of objects, properties of characters, properties of stuff from that third-person perspective. In a game, it really is able to put you into that story. That's something that's difficult to do in another medium. Very difficult to do. And because of that, when you as the protagonist take on characteristics or experience something in a way like you're just one of these weird people wandering around this empty, abandoned ghost town, you don't even think of it that way because it's normal for you, because that's you. You're the protagonist. You're the guy in the game. You just go around. That's what you do. You don't think about it. And it's a ghost portrait of reality. You don't have any of this connective structure going on. It's kind of like a child's drawing of a business. It's like there's like an office or whatever. If anybody's ever played Ib, there's like a world where there's a little girl she's a painting girl. She's not a real girl. Excuse me. Spoilers. Okay, it's over. Whatever. You've been spoiled. I'm sorry. She doesn't experience real life, so when she draws what she thinks the real world's like, it's just this like totally just crayon scribbled like stuff that's even younger than her age. That's debatable. I guess you could say it's normal stuff for a child, but in my opinion, a lot of it was about how she has this outside looking in view of the real world, and her portrait of it is very abstract, like a child's, and so when a child draws a business, they don't draw like the printers or like fax machines or like any of the details, because they don't know anything about that. And it's kind of the childish innocence of it is that they don't feel like, oh, I missed something. Like there was information that was not complete. I didn't provide a complete depiction. There wasn't verisimilitude. They don't think that because they don't even know, right? And there's no sense of sadness or bad stuff or emptiness about it, or any sense of being incomplete or having an incomplete picture at all, which I think is good for them, That being said, the whole verisimilitude thing, in my opinion, is really just about that. You want to see the logical connective structures necessary for human life to make sense. And there's also a bit of an economic undertone, too, in most discussions of verisimilitude. Well, I think that it's helpful when trying to comment on human life. I think in many ways it can become kind of like a gilded cage, which prevents us from imagining life beyond what we have today. I treasure greatly those experiences and works of art or media which can make me feel in a totally new way, detached greatly from the connective structure of reality today. I think that that's more valuable than most commentary you can give on the economy through, saying something meaningful is saying something that's truly, I don't know, yeah, you can do it. You can make a realistic world. You can try to get there. You're obviously never going to totally get there, but what's the point? Some people enjoy it. That's fine. I enjoy it sometimes. But I think it's become the extreme version of something which, usually most people, they're not out there saying, oh, we need verisimilitude, we need to see all the crops, we need to see what they're growing. They're more so just they're just oh, I have I Divine Cybermancy is an incomplete game because of all these questions that I don't have answers to. And I think that's stupid. I think that's just totally wrong. You're missing out on the beauty of a game that is so abstract and so dreamlike. This experience you can't get anywhere else. If I wanted to experience some slop where there's just oh, I know everything is super detailed and whatever, I would just go read some crappy fantasy novel where it's just giving me everything. And I don't care about that. I don't want to do it because it sucks and it's not interesting. And I'm going to give you this Andrei Tarkovsky quote. Got in my script. All right, I love this guy. So he said, "The artist exists because the world is not perfect. Art would be useless if the world were perfect, as man wouldn't look for harmony, but would simply live in it. Art is born out of an ill-designed world." And I agree, I really do, in the sense that how much of gaming and all this other stuff has been caught in the most vulgar ideas about realism. When is realism good? So, we I talked about earlier, excuse me, I do a lot of math, so, he's saying we, but, earlier we talked about, Walmart, I talked about Walmart, and it's you have this abstraction, where you don't see all this stuff. So in a real way, the real world isn't realistic. Your experience in the real world isn't realistic. You're obviously living in a realistic world, but your subjective level of knowledge, the level of information you have, it's very abstract. It depends on the person, of course. It totally depends on the person. But in 2000s America, 90s America, many things are quite abstract. It goes in the whole. I don't want to get into it because, for a variety of reasons, I'm not saying I agree with it or I think it's the most useful frame of reference, but it's the hyper real stuff, the Baudrillard I talked about, and it's just realism can be useful in that way because sometimes it teaches you to look at reality in a different way where you're appreciating more facts and details about it and you're putting together things that you wouldn't have if someone didn't. It's like photography. Photography, everything's out there in the real world. You're not adding anything new when you take a picture. But what you are doing is you're taking that camera and you're making somebody look at something specific, okay? And that's what you do when you write a work of realism or when you do something like that. You're taking something very specific and you're making them look at it. And they don't look at it normally. So they go through that little town and they don't pay attention to where the crops come from or what the history of the town is, or this or that. They don't care about it. But if you do that and you write a work where you make them really interested in some town of 2,000 people or whatever it is, just whatever it may be, some very real material situation, that's going to change the way they're going to look at stuff. But you know what? That's not what we're getting. That's not what we're comparing against. So I think it's quite unfair for abstractness in games and lack of information get such a bad rap. And I think that when you encounter it, you shouldn't necessarily view it as something to fill in the blanks for or that it has to exist to serve some other function. It can really be beautiful on its own. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.